Welcome to the Great Shrimp Shoal, and today we're going back to the basics as I am returning my attention to the two tanks that I have, with one in dire straits. But just today I noticed a surprise that has me very hopeful. Let's get inside and I'll fill you in. I was doing some maintenance on my 30-gallon tank and I had just finished cleaning the tubes for the filter when I noticed something odd in my other tank, the 10-gallon, containing the forest. I got really excited because I saw something that shouldn't be there, and it was a huge relief. Where I had only seen one or two of the baby jade green shrimp before, there was now a lot more movement. The bare patch where I dropped their food off was crawling with a bunch of snails, but also almost a dozen of the little fry, and I was for a minute greatly overjoyed. I was so sure that I had done a proper count a few weeks back and that there were only 5 of the fry in this tank that had survived. It turns out that I was way off. Not only did those 5 survive, it seems as though there is now 12 of them. And that's just out in the open on this bare patch. There may be a handful of them elsewhere among the rotala. It really means a lot to me that this community has managed to survive. The substrate is over a year and a half old now, and the plants have overgrown and been trimmed back 5 times or more. This tank took my favorite ghost shrimp and also took my very first Neocaridina cherry shrimp from me not too long ago. So I thought that it was definitely cursed, but evidently not so. It had turned out better than I had hoped for after losing every other shrimp in this tank. Now, I was looking at a viable crop of newborn community members. You can see that some of the individual shrimp have a vastly more defined shape. They appear to be about a month old now and could have molted 3 or more times. Instead of just the outline of a shrimp, they're starting to get the real telltale features like the rostrum, saddle, and the well-defined antenna. This is a really good sign because it also means that they're finding the nutrients required to molt, and that it's not just 1 or 2 who have survived is also a really big deal, because it means that all of them have been able to make do with what they've found inside the tank. My experience has been that the baby shrimp are not the hardiest of invertebrates. They need to molt a lot in their first few weeks. They also need a steady supply of right-sized food, and they need temperate water conditions. They're also susceptible to a long list of what seems like unlikely predators. In fact, just about anything will try and eat the fry if they're found out in the open in their first few days, including many of the smaller fish common in freshwater aquariums. There are no predators in this tank, so that is one thing these little munchkins don't have to worry about. As I have said before, I was going to try and overfeed this tank because I have the snails competing for food with the shrimp, and there are literally a ton of detritus worms that have just dominated the substrate. The worms cover the entire tank from front to back and both sides. They'd also get into the filter and rested the bottom of the filter area before I took it out. Overall, I don't feel like the detritus worms are an issue any longer, as long as they remain well fed. I haven't seen them swarm the shrimp food, but I do notice that their food of choice is the muck that forms just under the first layer of substrate. Honestly, there are so many worms in this tank that my secret nickname for it should actually be the worm forest, because that would be far more representative of what lives here currently. I've also noticed something else that is very telling about the worms' feeding habits. Most of this footage was recorded just after a fairly strong algae bloom, and I added the hang-on back filter again to start and give some movement to the water as well. As the cloudiness of the algae started to clear up, the worms also started to retreat back under the substrate, where it was safer, and were seen less free-floating or on the sides of the tank glass. But after a few days of really crystal clear water, there were clumps of algae forming on the tank glass again. This is not uncommon, but did signal the next stage of the algae growth potentially. Basically, it's my understanding that the algae follows a cycle of rooting, planting, reproducing, blooming, and then back to the rooting again, and the cycle repeats. As the algae clumped up, the detritus worms started venturing back out into the tank, but mostly stuck to the glass. It seemed like they really loved the algae, especially once it hit the more solid clumps that were forming on the glass. Just look at how many I have spotted in just a few inches. This could actually signal that the worms more directly compete with the younger shrimp fry, because it seemed that the shrimp fry wouldn't feed off the food that I was adding directly to the tank. So, if they were trying to feed on the biofilm, algae, or other growth, it would seem their greatest competition in the tank are the snails and the detritus worms. Even in this microcosm, it's survival of the fittest. So if there wasn't enough food to go around, someone would eventually starve. And that could be what happened to the previous shrimp fry that had hatched from other shrimp matriarchs. This quick time lapse, and I do mean quick because even though I recorded it over the course of 2 hours, the resulting clip is only a few seconds long, shows how much the snails and shrimp fry move around while feeding. It also gives a nice overview of exactly how many shrimp are now left in the forest, because this feeding area sees the cycle of all the shrimp coming to feed over the course of 2 hours. I really was missing a lot of what was going on, especially if I just recorded video for a few minutes trying to catch the few fry that I could see near the edge of the tank glass. It's nice to see that these shrimp are healthy and that they're starting to get their coloring, which looks to be a slight greenish tinge. Now, they're nowhere near as green as their ancestors were though, and we'll have to see just how that turns out in the coming months. Over in the mountains, I've been having only one minor issue. The feeding and the care of the community of shrimp there is going really well. I recorded a long 40-minute session that I will cut into a mellow feeding video immediately after this video publishes. The one issue that I've been dealing with though recently is a filter that seemed to be giving up the ghost. I had cleaned the filter from top to bottom and then restarted it, but the flow was almost at zero now. I worried initially that it was the impeller, because on some pumps they state that this crucial part is supposed to be replaced yearly. That's hard for me to believe though, because even as a mechanical part, it still doesn't seem to wear all that much, at least physically. After a bit of cleaning, it looks brand new. Now, most of that did very little to fix things, as I was still having a hard time clearing air out of the filter. It would start, and then after a little while of running, it would stop as a protective measure. I ended up tracing the problem to a clogged intake sponge, which was making the job of getting water into the system much more difficult now. When I pulled it out, it was easy to squeeze to try and clean, but it stayed squished and looked rather solid, so I rightly assumed that it was the culprit. Once I replaced the sponge with a temporary fix, things sped up considerably. You can see the new replacement here. Overall, the filter water had been slowed down appreciably over the past few months. Once this fix was in, the water returned to full blast and even started pushing the substrate around, which it hadn't done for a while. I'm sure that the bamboo shrimp appreciated the change too. They've been spending more time bobbing up and down on the bronze sword plant near the front of the tank instead of just roaming around on the substrate. And when I say bobbing around, I am not exaggerating. Just look at this guy. The food must be good to have to deal with all that constant movement. Again, the bamboo shrimp are filter feeders first, so a good amount of water flowing in the tank is super helpful to keep them super healthful. One of this pair has recently molted as well, so they need to keep their energy up to regain the lost nutrients. I'm thinking it's this guy because he seems really determined. The rest of the mountains is doing really well. The moss that is starting to cover the rocks will need a trim soon, and I'm really liking the way that this centerpiece is growing out. I hadn't anticipated the moss taking center stage, but it's obviously become a favorite for the shrimp and the snails even. It's not a quick growing plant, so I'll have to be careful when and where I trim it, as the results could have effects for months to come. If you look really closely here, you can see a juvenile shrimp that is only about a week or so old on the moss. But it can be like playing a game of Where's Waldo if you're not looking with an informed eye. I'm not going to ruin that surprise for you though. Part of the fun of having a shrimp tank like this is spotting the fry for the first time. And honestly, the wonder and excitement hasn't died out yet, even after so many generations of newly hatched babies. Back in the forest, I'm weighing my options. I don't want to let the algae get too out of control. I'll probably do a light cleaning and a smaller water change in the next few days. I usually let the worms try and sort themselves out, but I'll probably try and remove a couple of them to keep my morale up. Nothing dims your hopes like seeing a fish tank crawling with invaders who are doing a better job multiplying and living than your intended residents. As for the residents in the mountains, I think that they're doing really well. Not going to mess around here too much for a while. I am going to trim the rotala though and clean the top of the acrylic, which has seen the growth of some water spots and mold. I'm also going to forage some new cypress pine cones for all of my tanks because they have been received so well by the shrimp that are living here. Thank you guys for showing up and participating in the growth of my channel. I honestly wouldn't do it without you. The videos, that is. The shrimp keeping is actually a fun stress reliever and I can't recommend it enough, even to newcomers, so I would continue doing that. I'm going to do a recap soon to go over all of the things that you should assemble and be aware of when starting your own dwarf shrimp community. Hopefully that will round out my first year nicely. Until then, I hope that you have some sweet shrimpy dreams before we meet next. And be sure to tell your friends about the wonderful, fanciful, and not yet traveling Great Shrimp Shoal. I'll see you next time. Good night.